Okay, it's your last video of the week. This week we begin our study of Greek philosophy. We don't end it, we'll continue it next week, but we commence our study this week. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Socrates and Plato to prepare you for your actual Plato readings. You're going to read the entirety of a dialogue called the Crito, and you're going to read a portion, a very small portion of the Republic, specifically the allegory of the cave. And I'll just alert you to the fact already that there is a lecture this week from Dr. Edmondson on Socrates and Plato. Really good idea to also watch that too, if you can, before you do the reading. It's not absolutely essential, but I think it will help you, and it will allow me not to have to do everything in this video. So watch this video in tandem with Dr. Edmondson's lecture. The very first thing I want to say, especially as we really begin for the very first time ever to read philosophy in this class, you've read no works of philosophy up to this point, is to say something about philosophy in the ancient world and in ancient Greece in particular. We tend to think of philosophy as a very kind of eccentric, abstract, technical pursuit that doesn't really have a lot to do with our everyday lives. And that's not at all the way that philosophy was viewed in ancient Greece. Philosophy was seen as a way of life. So if you belong to a certain philosophical school, you might dress in a certain way, and you were expected to behave in a certain way. So the ultimate question for Greek philosophers, this is true of Socrates, of Plato, of Aristotle, all of them, the ultimate question is how to live in the world. What is the best way to live in the world? What is the good life, and how do you attain it? How do you pursue it? As Dr. Kennison said in his lecture, philosophy is very much about questioning assumptions, and that's absolutely what Socrates and Plato were interested in. But they weren't doing it for the sake of it, and they weren't doing it just to show people how foolish they were. They were examining their assumptions because our assumptions deeply inform the way that we live. Our assumptions about the world matter. They affect our lives, so they need to be examined. So yes, it's true, philosophy does involve some sort of abstract reflection, but that abstract reflection is always in the service of a greater goal, and that is to master the art of living. All right, a brief little word about Socrates and Plato. Socrates, his dates, born around 470, died in 399 BCE. So he is basically a 5th century figure. Here's something very important to grasp about Socrates. As important of a figure as he is, as far as we know, he never wrote a word. He did philosophy all the time, but through oral means. He didn't write anything down. So who was he and what did he do? Well, he apparently was a stonemason. But he spent an awful lot of time going around Athens asking people awkward questions that in many cases made the person look rather foolish. So he was known as the gadfly of Athens. He would go around Athens irritating people, often people who were fairly important. And this leads ultimately to his trial and death in the year 399. His formal charge was that of corrupting the youth, but I think we have to think that the real reason he found himself in the dock and the real reason he found himself sentenced to death was because of the way that he ruffled feathers during his lifetime. So that's Socrates. Now, Plato is, of course, very closely associated with Socrates, but he's a philosopher in his own right. His dates are 427 to 347 BC. So his life overlaps with Socrates, but he's quite a bit younger. And indeed, he was the pupil of Socrates. He was an Athenian as well, and he studies under Socrates. He went on to found the Academy in Athens, which was a kind of semi-formal philosophical school. And unlike his teacher, Plato wrote, and he wrote a lot. Now, a word of caution when you read Plato. He wrote almost exclusively dialogues, okay? Writings in which there are two or more speakers having a conversation. And in almost all of his works, and in both of the works that we are reading, one of the speakers in the dialogue is none other than Socrates himself. But you have to be careful not to jump to conclusions and assume that what Plato is trying to do is give us a historically accurate picture of Socrates. Rather, it would appear that he uses Socrates as a kind of mouthpiece for some of his own ideas, for some of Plato's own ideas. So just because he attributes a certain idea to Socrates, it's possible it was Socrates' idea, and then Plato adopted it. It's also possible that it's not an idea of Socrates's, but one that Plato puts in his mouth. So we have to be careful about that. There's just no good way of knowing how close the real historical Socrates was to the kind of fictional Socrates that we meet in Plato's dialogues. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce both of the readings, starting with the Credo. The basic situation, the premise of the Credo is fairly simple. Socrates is in prison. You know now why he was in prison. His death was imminent. He expected to die in the next day or so. Crito is one of Socrates' friends and a kind of aspiring philosopher, although it turns out that maybe he's not a great philosopher, at least not yet. And Crito, of course, who has a great deal of affection for Socrates, Crito wants to break Socrates out of prison so he can escape, leave Athens, and live out the remainder of his days somewhere else. And he's quite confident that he can do this. So really the dialogue begins with Crito laying out his case for why Socrates should go along with his plan. As you will see, Socrates himself is not terribly impressed by Crito's argument. And so really the remainder of the dialogue is Socrates laying out why it is exactly that he cannot go along with Crito's plan, not because he was afraid it might not work or they would get caught or something like that, but because he thought it would be the wrong thing to do. So one of the questions that he's going to first ask, Socrates will first ask of Crito, is, should we allow other people's opinions to influence our moral decisions? Crito certainly seems to suggest early on that we should. As you'll see, Socrates has very different ideas. Socrates' argument, which is really, that's what most of the Credo is. It's Socrates kind of unfolding his argument for why escaping the jail, eluding his death sentence, would be wrong. And really, the argument kind of boils down to two major questions, both of which Socrates will answer. The first is very simple in some ways, maybe deceptively simple. Do we always have to do what's right? Do we always have to do what's right? Or might it be possible that if the circumstances of a situation are such, it's permissible to do the wrong thing? Or, in a slightly different kind of twist, do we take into account what we think will be the consequences of an action, should that influence our moral decisions? If we think that something is, wrong, or ordinarily would be the wrong thing to do, but the consequences would be positive, then does that mean it's justified to go ahead and do it. So anyway, that's question number one. Do we always have to do what's right? You're going to see how Socrates will answer that question. So be looking for that answer. And then the second question is the more practical one, which is, in this particular case, what is the right thing to do? Okay. He will then continue the argument. And once you get toward the end, you can see that what he's really concerned about, what Socrates is really concerned about, and that is fulfilling our just obligations, or we might just say doing our duty. That's really sort of Socrates' ultimate concern. Not so much, what is my right, or what do I deserve, or something like that, but rather, what is my duty? And you'll see, and this is very contrary, I think, to the way that most modern people think today. Socrates sees his ultimate duty as being owed to the polis, which in his case, of course, was Athens. So one of the questions you need to be able to answer once you've gotten to the end of the Credo is, why does he think that escaping from jail would be a failure to do his duty to the polis of Athens? And indeed, why does he think that escaping from prison would actually be an act of violence against the Athenian state? So be looking for that towards the final third or so of the reading. One other thing I want you to pay attention to is not simply the particular argument that he makes in this case, but his method. How does Socrates go about moral reasoning? Because in a way, what the Credo is offering is a kind of model of moral reasoning. I mean, most people are not going to find themselves in the exact same situation as Socrates, right? Sitting on death row, but you've got well-connected friends who can help you escape. What are you going to do? I mean, this is not something that most of us are going to have to face in our life. So this dialogue can only be relevant to most readers if it provides a kind of template, a paradigm for how to go about thinking about moral questions. So one way of thinking about this is, who are the authorities for Socrates? When you're trying to make moral decisions, to whom or to what do you look for guidance? And note where Socrates does not look for guidance. One example would be received wisdom. So Socrates is never going to say something like, well, as my grandpappy once said, two wrongs make a right, or something like that. No, right? What anybody's grandpappy said is totally irrelevant. Well, what about religion? Right? A lot of people today look to their religion for moral guidance. Well, on the one hand, Socrates does seem to believe in God. And he says even at one point, this is page 117, let us do as I say, seeing that God so directs us. He says elsewhere that it's against the law of God to do violence to one's country. So that might give you the impression that he's turning to religion for moral guidance, but that's actually not really the case. How do you know what God wants? Do you turn to a set of sacred texts? Do you consult the religious authorities in your community, the pagan priests of Athens? For Socrates, the answer is emphatically no. The only way to find out what God wants is also the only way to go about moral reasoning at all, and that is to use your reason. Everybody has reason implanted inside them, and that reason is sufficient by itself for making even very difficult moral decisions. Okay? So only rational argument can help you arrive at the right decisions. So really, you're going to have to tune out a lot of the background noise because people are going to be telling you this is the right way to act, or this is usually wrong, but it's okay in this situation, or something like that. No, you tune all out and you listen to your reason alone. And I do think it's significant that all of Plato's works, except for one, the Apology, are written in dialogue form. I think the implication is that we arrive at the truth through rational conversation, through rational argument, where we exclude all other considerations except what is rational. So I think that's one important observation to make as you work through the Credo. Okay, the other work you're going to read by Plato is the Allegory of the Cave. This is from a much larger work called the Republic. In our reading, Socrates is the only speaker. Now, the work as a whole is a dialogue, but what we're reading is just a very long monologue by Socrates. And the work itself, the broader work, the Republic, is, as the name suggests, a work of political philosophy. And more specifically, what's going on in this work is that Socrates and others are sort of speculating about what would be the ideal form of government. In a perfect world, who would be in charge? Who would rule? How would the government be arranged? And that's the question in the background when Socrates tells this allegory of the cave. Now, you need to know what an allegory is. I think you'll probably figure it out. It's very close to a parable. And indeed, the allegory of the cave is a kind of parable. But an allegory is a symbolic narrative with more than one level of meaning. So in an allegory, you've got kind of the literal sense of the story, but what's more important than the literal sense of the story is its deeper meaning, its symbolic meaning. So as you read the Allegory of the Cave, your main task is to decipher the symbolism. So you need to ask yourself questions like, what does the cave represent? What does it symbolize? What about the person who manages to leave the cave and actually enter into broad daylight? What does that person represent? What about the decision of that person to re-enter the cave? Symbolically speaking, what is the significance of that decision? And of course, all the while, as I've already indicated, you have to ask the question, what in the world does this story have to do with politics? Because if you look at it just at the literal level, it doesn't really have anything to do with politics. But on the allegorical level, it does. So be thinking about that. And let me give you something even more concrete to think about as you read this. Plato, we know, was highly suspicious of, we might even say hostile toward, democracy. Might be a little bit surprising in some ways because he was an Athenian, and of course Athens had the premier democracy of the Greek world. But there are other reasons why he was not so keen on democracy. Of course, one is that a democracy put his beloved mentor to death, so we don't want to discount that. But I think he had more principled reasons to be very wary of democracy, and I think those come through in the Allegory of the Cave. So you need to be able to look at the Allegory of the Cave and explain how it reflects Plato's suspicions and worries about democracy. So this allegory does reveal a lot about Plato's political philosophy. But as you know from Dr. Kennison's lecture, political philosophy is only one of a number of different branches of philosophy. And I think the Allegory of the Cave also gives us a lot of insight into what is perhaps the ultimate, the highest branch of philosophy, which is metaphysics. 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 Metaphysics is sort of the philosophy, one's view of reality. What is there? What is really real? That is one of the key questions of metaphysics. What is illusion? What is only appearance? And what is actually real? What are the fundamental constituents of reality? Now, Dr. Edmondson's lecture, I'm going to plug it again, it's really going to help you on this. He's going to talk about Plato's notion of the world of forms and ideas on the one hand, and the kind of world of illusion in which we live. And the allegory of the cave is very much about this, right? The allegory of the cave is about a person who leaves the realm of illusion and enters into the sphere of truth, and comes to, for the first time, comes to a real, genuine understanding of what truth is, what beauty is, what justice and goodness are, etc., etc. One last thing to contemplate as you are reading the allegory of the cave. I think one of the lessons, one of the morals of the allegory of the cave is that philosophy is pain. Becoming a philosopher is a painful process. Now, I don't mean becoming a professional philosopher, where you're teaching philosophy at a university. This is not really what Plato has in mind here. Rather, he means a kind of a philosophical approach to life. If you want to have a philosophical approach to life, it is going to be difficult and painful. Because if you start to really examine your own assumptions, the assumptions of others about what is true and good and beautiful, that's going to be a painful process, because you're going to discover that many of those assumptions, some of which you deeply cherish, simply will not withstand critical scrutiny. They just don't hold water. They're inadequate, and they're going to have to be replaced by other assumptions. And I think Plato really stresses this in the allegory of the cave. Look at the way, when the man in the cave gets released from this chains, and he turns around, and for the first time ever, he looks at the fire directly. It virtually blinds him. And then he kind of stumbles out of the cave. But once he stumbles out of the cave, again, the sunlight just overpowers him. It hurts his eyes, and he has to really kind of build up his tolerance to the sunlight before he can look directly at it. And there's other kinds of pain involved too, right? There's the moment when he goes back into the cave, and everybody laughs at him and thinks he's an idiot. So he has this kind of social estrangement from his peers, which is also very painful. And again, this is true of philosophy. If you really want to live a philosophical way of life, where reason is the ultimate arbiter of truth, and you're willing to reject any idea or any assumption that does not meet the demands of reason, that's going to be painful. It's going to alienate us from other people. It's going to put strains on our relationships with others, and so on. So you're kind of left with the question, in a way, why be a philosopher, right? Why actually undertake this way of life if it's going to result in so much pain? I think there's a couple of answers here from the allegory of the cave. One answer certainly is, well, you should do it for the sake of the polis. It benefits the polis. It is for the welfare of the polis if there are philosophers in its midst. Because philosophers can offer a kind of wisdom and guidance that no one else can. The polis needs wise leaders. Now, it's true that, in a sense, the philosopher himself or herself still suffers, but everybody else benefits from his or her wisdom. So philosophy is not a self-indulgent kind of pursuit. Rather, quite the opposite. It's a kind of selfless act. But there is a bit of a selfish element in it as well. Coming to know the truth, which of course is one of the goals of the philosopher, coming to know the truth, you discover that the truth is good and it is beautiful, and a life devoted to it is a happy life, and maybe the only happy life. Yes, there are those initial stages of pain, but then you get to the point where you can just gaze in wonder at the sun, which represents the form of goodness, and realize that this is the only place where happiness is to be found. And remember, this is why the philosopher does not want to go back into the cave, because he's found his happy place. And the cave is really the opposite of that. But he's willing to go back into the cave for the benefit of his fellow citizens. One last point about why philosophy is worth doing despite the pain that it entails. I think for Plato, it also boils down to a question of freedom. Being philosophical is the only way to actually be free. Because without critical reflection, we cannot come to know the truth. And if we don't know the truth, we become enslaved by illusions. Illusions posing as the truth. So the only free life is the philosophical life. And I have to say, I think there is a lot of wisdom in what Plato is saying here, because there are a lot of forces at work in our culture that don't really want us to arrive at the truth, but want us to arrive at their truth, right? The truth of a political party, the truth of a giant company who wants to sell you their goods, and so on. And so how can you consider yourself free if your whole life is built around these illusions that you accept as truth? So I think this really is something well worth reflecting on even today. All right, well, I hope you enjoy those readings, and I'll see you next week.